When I'm working with my students in our networking lab, we do a ton of virtualized networks. And one of the most common questions I get from my students is, Troy, which virtual switch should I use here? Virtual switches, they can be confusing. So in this video, let's deconfuse them. Unconfuse them. Let's figure out virtual switches. Hey everybody, Troy here. Today we're doing a deep dive into the wonderful world of virtual switches. We're going to be walking through the 4 most common virtual switch configurations, comparing them side by side so you can see exactly which switch does what and in what circumstances, so you can learn to apply these switches yourself for your own virtual environments. Now, there's a lot to cover in today's video. As always, timestamps are going to be available to you in the description below. Jump around to the particular switch you're most interested in, or we'll walk through every switch one by one together, and you'll get a feel for these things in action. Let's start with a quick look at my topology. This is what I'm working with. I've got a Hyper-V environment running with 2 virtual machines that have yet to be assigned a virtual switch. I'm running 2 instances of Windows Server 2022. All I'm using these for is to help us test and visualize these virtual switches. Now, before I go too far though, I do want to stipulate that although I'm using a Hyper-V environment, these switch configurations are common to VMware as well as VirtualBox. So even though I'm using Microsoft Hyper-V Client, you'll be able to use the same mentality and concepts to other virtualized environments if you're using a different application. All right, let's jump to our first virtual switch. It's probably the simplest one to use. It's very, very common, and it's also one of the easiest to understand. It's something we call the private virtual switch. Now, if you've seen many of my videos, you'll see I'm using a private switch all the time. The reason I do it is it provides me a nice isolated virtual environment. And by isolated, what I mean is my virtual machines can talk amongst themselves. I can build a complete interconnected network here virtually, and there's no connection with my local area network. Now that lets me do all sorts of cool things in my virtualized environment without risk of affecting anything in my live environment. All right, let's deploy a private switch and see this thing in action. What I'm going to do is jump first to my Hyper-V manager. You see I've got my 2 virtual machines sitting there running, ready for me to apply this switch. And I'm going to have to first build this switch. Now in Hyper-V, I have an option to manage my virtual switches via something called the Virtual Switch Manager. Over here on the right-hand side, I'm going to open it up. And the first thing you're going to see is that there already exists one switch called the default switch. Now, we are absolutely going to talk about that switch today, but before I get there, I want to talk about some of these more simpler switches. But what you can see is that the private switch does not exist. The first thing I have to do is I have to use my create virtual switch option. You'll see that I have different options: external, internal, private. Now the one we're after first is the private switch, and it tells you exactly what this switch does. It creates a virtual switch that can be used only by the virtual machines that run on the physical computer. What that's saying is that there's no connectivity using this switch from your virtual machines to your host environment. Creating one is as simple as clicking the Create Virtual Switch button. I now have a chance to name it. I'm going to keep it nice and simple. I'm going to call it private. And you can see right here that the connection type defaults to what I requested, the private setting. Okay, good stuff. I'm going to hit apply. That private switch is now created and ready to be attached to my virtual machines. I'm going to hit OK. Now, essentially what I did, everybody, is I built that. That's what we did. Now what we're going to do is we're going to attach our 2 virtual machines and watch them connect via that private switch. Now, first things first, I need to assign this new virtual switch to these virtual machines. Now I can do this while they're running because these are Gen 2 machines. I'm going to right click on each of them independently. I'm going to right click on test 01, select the settings option, and right here, I've got a chance to define the network adapter, aka the virtual switch, that is going to connect to this machine. All I need simply do is select my network adapter option, and then I'm going to select from the drop-down list right here the switch that I want. I want private. That's what I just built. I'm going to hit apply, and now that adapter is connected to the machine. In effect, this machine now has a private virtual interface. Let's hit OK, and let's do the same thing for the second virtual machine. A right click on the machine name, down to the network adapter. From the drop down list, I'm going to hit the word private. I'm going to hit apply, and there we go. Now, as I said, all I've done now is interconnect these two machines. Now, this is a completely isolated and separate environment, which means I have to decide the address space, the connectivity, all of this is now in my control. Now, by default, these machines would be looking to be dynamically addressed. They're looking for a DHCP server. As you can see that although I'm running Windows Server 2022, I've not configured either one to be those. I need to manually apply some static addresses. I'm going to jump to my virtual machines, and there they are, test 1, test 2. There they are, ready to have an address assigned. Let's do that. Right click on Open Network and Internet Settings. I'm going to click on my Change Adapter options. There's my adapter, and I'm going to go to our properties for TCP/IP v4. Let's change the default from Obtain an IP address automatically, and let's assign a static address. Let's keep it nice and simple. How about some 10s? 10, 10, 10, 1 on, let's do a /24. There we go. Now, I don't currently have a default gateway configured. That also means I don't have a path to the intranet. One of the unique things about a private, isolated virtual switch environment is that by default, there is no outside connectivity to my LAN or, by extension, the internet. So I'm not going to worry about putting a default gateway in here, nor am I going to worry about a DNS server at this point in time. I just want to check the connectivity by hitting OK, OK, close. There's my adapter. That's all set. And let's go over to my second virtual machine, do the same thing. Change the adapter options, and there's my Ethernet adapter, which the VM is recognizing as a private switch, IPv4, and let's give it another address on that internal network that I just built. I'm going to go 10, 10, 10, 2. And I'm going to go 255.255.255.0. Fantastic. Let's hit OK, close that particular window, and let's see if we can talk. Now, again, what I've built here is I've built connection between these two virtual machines, and they should now be able to communicate. I'm going to click on the command line for my first machine. I'm going to do a little bit of an IP config to verify that, yes, it has received the address I've given it, and let's ping its buddy at 10, 10, 10, 2. Full round trip for ICMP, that is telling me that I've got connectivity to my other virtual machine. Now, what I've just proven is that I have interconnectivity between these two virtual machines, which is exactly what I was after. I could deploy this as a domain controller and a client. I could deploy all sorts of cool applications and environments here to test and practice my skills without any connection to my host. I can verify that because my host, the interface address of my host is 192.168.1.66, which if I were to try to ping that 192.168.1.66, you're going to see that that's going to fail. Beautiful. So private switch, completely isolated, interconnected with the VMs, but not talking to the host. A good option if you want to build a lab environment to test and work with some machines without the need for internet connectivity. Excellent. Let's take a look at the next simplest switch I think is to understand, and that's something we call the internal switch. Let's take a look at another diagram here for you where I can demonstrate visually what this will do. We've already deployed connectivity between our two virtual machines using the private switch. There was no connectivity, as we verified, from our virtual network environment to our host LAN or our host machine. Now, what if we wanted that? Well, I could change the switch from being private to what we call internal. Now, what that does is it's going to create a special virtual Ethernet adapter on my host machine, and that Ethernet adapter will become part of my virtualized network. That means that my host machine can then have an address on that virtual network that I've built and participate in that virtual world that I've created with my VMs. Let me show you. I'm going to go back to my virtual switch manager right here. What I'm going to do, and again, just like I had to do with the private switch, I'm going to build a new switch. There it is right there. I want an internal switch. I'm going to create a new internal switch, and to keep it straight, I'm going to use my creative switch naming scheme. I'm going to call it what it is. This is an internal switch. Pay close attention. There is my connection type defaulting to internal, and that's what I want to see here. Now I'm going to hit the apply button, and I'm going to hit OK. Now watch what happened here. First, let me show you the new virtual adapter on my host machines. Now I'm just on my host machine navigating to my adapter options here, and look at this. This was not there before. This is what I just created, a virtual Ethernet interface called internal. That's the name I gave it, and it identifies exactly what it is. Now this NIC, so far as my computer goes, is actually a portal to my virtualized environment. So let's make it part of that world. I gave this computer right here an address of 10.10.10.1. I gave this computer an address of 10.10.10.2. Let's make our host part of this world via this virtual Ethernet adapter, and I'm going to give it an address of, say, 10.10.10.3. So I work with this NIC the same way I work with any other interface. I'm going to right click, go under my properties option, double click my IPv4. Again, the default option is obtain an IP address automatically. I don't want that. I'm going to give this an address on my virtual environment, and I said I'm going to allocate it as 10.10.10.3. Again, I'm going to get the correct subnet mask here. I'm going to click OK. OK one more time to close up that window. And I'm going to minimize this screen here, go back to my Hyper-V manager. Now I created this new switch. I'm going to assign this new switch to my virtual machines. Again, as easy as a right click, test 01. I'm going to connect to the settings. And now, right now it's set to the private adapter. I don't want that anymore. I want this guy now to be the internal switch. So this internal virtual switch, it is now connected. I'm going to go to test 02, settings, network adapter, private from the list is where I had it set last. I'm going to go to internal now, click apply, OK, and away we go. Again, what I've done here, everybody, is I've gone to my virtual machine 1 and I've changed the network adapter from private to internal. I have done the same thing on test machine 2. And before I did that, I assigned an address on this virtual network space of 10.10.10.3 to my internal virtual Ethernet adapter on my host machine. Let's watch the connectivity. I'm going to go here, open up my machines, and let's grab my command line one more time. And this time I'm going to ping. Let's start off by pinging my neighbor, 10.10.2. That's my test 2 machine. That's still working. Let's now test a ping to my host machine, 10.10.10.3. That's the virtual NIC of my host. Couple things to remember. I still have no connectivity to the LAN. So if I wanted to try pinging my host on its LAN address of 192.168.1.66, I'm still not connected to it. I am still isolated from that local area network. Again, if I wanted to have some kind of network configuration where my host is part of my virtual world, an internal switch will do it, but that internal configuration is still isolated from my LAN and from the internet. So under this basic configuration, my environment is completely isolated, except my host is part of my virtual machine world. Fantastic. We've now done 2 of the 4 virtual switches that I want to cover off in this video. We've seen private, which is a completely isolated virtual machine environment. No connection to the host machine or the local area network. We've also configured an internal virtual switch, which creates a special vEthernet adapter on my host machine, allowing it to participate in my virtualized environment. Again, no connectivity to the LAN, nor any default connectivity to the internet. Now I know what you're thinking, Troy, we really like the internet. What if we want a virtual machine to be able to access the internet? How do we do that? Well, the simplest and easiest configuration to make this happen is something called the default switch. Let's switch our diagrams up and you can see this thing in action. I'm going to go to this other alternative configuration. Now, you're going to see it looks a lot like the internal configuration that we had. The only difference is that I'm not going to utilize that specially created virtual Ethernet internal adapter. I'm going to connect to the default. Now, no doubt you remember that default switch was already there. We saw that in Hyper-V Switch Manager. As a matter of fact, the moment we turned on Windows Hyper-V Client as a feature in our operating system, that virtual Ethernet adapter was created. That default switch became part of your Hyper-V Manager library and was ready to be applied to a virtual machine. But what does it do? Well, let me demonstrate it in action first, and then I'll talk about it and make sense of what we see. Let's minimize this and go back to my virtual machines. Now, to help me demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to my network settings on my virtual machine. And what I'm going to do first, before I demo this, I'm going to go to my adapter options and I'm going to remove that static addressing that we gave. Remember, we assigned it a manual address of 10.10.10.1. I'm going to change that back to make this DHCP. I want to look for an automatic assignment of an IPv4 address. Let's do the same thing on my other machine. Adapter options, there's my Ethernet adapter. Protocol 4, obtain automatically both DNS and my IP address. Click OK, close. And you'll see what I've done here is I've removed that static assignment on those virtual machines. Now let's take a quick look at my settings on my host. Remember, I have this thing here sitting here called my vEthernet default switch. Let's take a quick look at it. I'm going to go to the properties and you're going to see that when I double click on my IPv4, there's an odd looking private address space right there. 172.21.240.1 on a 255.255.240 mask. No default gateway, interesting enough. No default preferred DNS, just this weird little IP address. And you can see it if I do a command line IP config here on my host, you're going to see that I can identify that adapter. There it is right there. Sitting right there, 172.21.240.1. Now, remember that number. That's going to become important to us in just a moment. I'm going to minimize this, minimize this, minimize this. Let's go to my Hyper-V manager and let's change the switches or the virtual NICs attached to our virtual machines. Remember, in my switch manager, the default switch was already created. I don't have to do anything special here. I'm going to right-click on test 01. I'm going to move to the settings. And I'm going to change my network adapter from internal to default. Click apply. Okay, let's do the same thing on my second machine. There we go. Network adapter, change to default. Click apply, and look at this. Ooh, something cool has happened. I have now, on these virtual machines have just become part of another network. So they found a network and now they're asking whether they want to be discoverable on that network. Sure, let's go yes, and let's see what happened. Now I also noticed something else really cool. On this virtual machine, something else has changed. Look at this. There's no longer a little red X over my Ethernet adapter. What that means is that I might have internet access. Let's take a quick look here. Ooh, look at that. I am now connected to the internet with this virtual machine. Let's dive deeper. I'm going to go to my command line and I'm going to do an IP config and let's see what I got. Now, this machine has dynamically received, so there was some kind of DHCP process here. This machine has dynamically received an address, and that address is 172.21.25.185. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Let's do a command line IP config. See what I got here. This virtual machine has a dynamically assigned address as well, 172.21.255.214. Feels kind of random, but there's actually a bigger plan at play. Look at this number, everybody. What I want you to do is take a good look there at the default gateways for these machines. 172.21.240.1. Does that look familiar? It should. If I go back to my host command line, look at that. That happens to be the address associated with my default virtual NIC on my host machine. That's the address of that interface. So what we now know is that this particular default switch, this vEthernet interface at 172.21.240.1, well, that is the default gateway for both of these virtual machines. And these virtual machines now not only can talk to each other, but they can also talk to the internet. Let's verify. What I'm going to do here is a ping to the other machine. So I'm on my test PC1 and I'm going to go ping 172.21.255.214. Everybody, what I'm doing is I'm pinging that address right there. Get in there. There we go. There's my ping. I can ping my other virtual machine. Let's see if I can ping my default gateway, 172.21.240.1. I can ping the virtual interface of my host. Now that's really interesting because now I can also ping my friend Google. Let's look at our diagram again to make sense of this. Here's what's happened. This is kind of a magic adapter. It's a little different than the internal one we just looked at because of the functionality that it brings. It did two important things. First off, it enabled my host to serve as a DHCP server and automatically hand out dynamically assigned addresses to these two virtual machines. My machines can utilize those addresses and interconnect and talk. This adapter is also acting as the default gateway for these two machines, which means these guys have a path out to the internet. Now, how's it getting there? Well, what this adapter is doing is it's actually performing something we call network address translation. NAT for short, N-A-T. Now, how NAT works, we could do a complete video on. Network address translation is an entity unto its own, but let me summarize what's happening for you so you know what's going on. What this adapter is doing is it's allowing traffic to come from this virtual machine and be translated from the virtual network, which we know is a 172 network, and grab a temporary assignment, an address on my virtual area network. Now, this is all managed by the host. It's seamless. You don't even see it happening. But what it's doing is it's translating my virtual address into an address on my physical network, my home local area network. And because of that, it can then reach my home area network, its default gateway, which will allow it to get out to the internet. Now, I've shown you that I can get out to the internet with these two machines, but there's something else that's really important to know. This machine now can talk to anybody on the local area network as well. I can show you my physical interface. My adapter for my host machine is 192.168.1.66. There's my default gateway, my router. And if we go back to the virtual machine and I want to do some pinging, let me try to ping not just the internet, but I'm going to ping the physical adapter of my host. I can reach it. I can also reach the router. Look at that. I can reach that. Now, this is very important to know. Because I can reach the interfaces of the devices that are on my local area network, this means that my virtual machines are actually intrinsically connected to that local area network. Any device on my home local area network is now potentially reachable from the virtual machines. So the default switch has given me some cool things. What it's let me do is dynamically assign these addresses. It has also let these machines get out to the internet and interconnect with virtually anything on my home area network. The result is a sort of isolated network. It's got its own independent address space, and I could do all sorts of cool things in here, but I do have to realize that the price of my internet connectivity is access to that local area network. And if I wanted to use this environment as some kind of sandbox for testing purposes, I want to make sure that I realize that there are circumstances under which I can reach my home network thanks to this connectivity. But you're thinking, hold on, one of the reasons I might want to use a virtual machine is to test things that I don't want to test in my real production or my real local area network. And I want to use a virtual machine for that. This configuration is not your best choice. As we said, we can connect to my devices on my LAN due to the nature of how this works. We don't want to be doing anything dangerous in this default environment. Now, if you're running Windows 10 or Windows 11 that has the capability of client Hyper-V, you also have the functionality of something we call Windows Sandbox. If I go into my Windows feature, Windows Education, Enterprise, and Professional has this option called Windows Sandbox. There it is right there. And we can enable that. And that is another playground for you that is actually designed for testing exactly those questionable things that we want to play with in a completely isolated sandbox environment. I'll try to get to do a video on that for you so you can get a demo of that. It's very similar to Hyper-V in terms of its behavior, but it's designed specifically for that reason. Great, another virtual switch down. We now have seen private in action, internal in action, and default in action. Let's look at the last one, something we call an external switch. Okay, before we deploy an external switch, let's take a quick look at a different diagram. What I'm going to do is bring up a slightly amended topology here for you to help you try to visualize this. It is a little different than the internal and the private and the default configurations that we've been looking at, and I've changed the diagram to give you a different view of this. Now, you remember that my machine currently has one network interface card. It has one physical network adapter that is connecting me to my local area network and, by extension, the internet. Now, Hyper-V lets me borrow that particular network adapter. In effect, I can use that adapter as a portal to the outside world with the configuration of an external virtual switch. So functionally, what happens when I build an external virtual switch? What I'm doing is I'm going to attach all of these virtual machines to it, and they are going to be using that single network physical interface, the one on my host computer, as a means to get to the default gateway of my local area network and get out to the world. Now, it will be creating another special virtual Ethernet adapter. It'll be working a little bit differently than the internal one did, as well as the default. Basically, what this adapter is going to let me do is choose whether my host machine wants to be part of this new local area network configuration or not. And depending on what I'm building, I'll have to make that decision. Let me demonstrate. So in order to make the most sense of this, the first thing I'm going to do is start with a clean slate. I'm going to move to my adapter on my virtual machine, and I'm going to change the state of this adapter. I'm going to disable it. Okay, I want it off for now. Although it's right now connected to that default switch, I'm going to disable it. So I want you to see what happens when I make some changes to the switch environment in Hyper-V. I'm going to do the same thing over here on my second test VM. Change that adapter option. I'm going to disable that. No more connectivity. Now to our Hyper-V manager. Let's move into our Hyper-V switch manager and let's manage our options. What you see here is we've got our three switches. The default switch, which came with Hyper-V, we've got the one that we built called private. We've got one that was called internal. I'm going to build now one called external. There it is right there. So I'm going to create a virtual switch called, you guessed it, external. And look at here. What it's doing here is it's already identifying that it's going to be utilizing my network adapter of my host. There's only one. It's sitting right here. It's my Intel adapter. And by default, what it's going to do is have this checkbox checked, which basically says allow the management operating system to share this network adapter. It's not really sharing it. And the verbiage there is a little bit confusing. I like to think of it more as, do I want my host machine to participate in this local area network that's going to be constructed the moment I apply this switch to my virtual machines? If yes, I leave it checked. If no, I disable it. We'll do both so you can see the differences. So let's hit apply. And it warns me. This change might disrupt my network connectivity. It's warning me on my host. Let's hit yes. There we go. We've got a few changes. Everything is made. A whole bunch of things happen. You see my virtual machines have changed too. So this is a special one. We want to deal with this very carefully. Okay, first things first, let's hit OK. Let's go take a look at my host machine. There it is. Look at this. This is brand new. That wasn't there before. The vEthernet external, a virtual Ethernet adapter added to my host, and it's called external. That's what we called it. This is my external virtual switch. You can see my default switch is still there, as is my internal switch, but now I am going to work this into my world. Let's right click, take a look at the properties first and see what we see here. Look at this. This is a dynamic element. There is no specific address assigned to this because in essence, it's actually borrowing this adapter. Remember, we married this thing to my Intel adapter. That's my physical interface on my host machine. Let's minimize this. Let's minimize this, and let's attach this external switch to my virtual machines. I'm going to go to right click my virtual machine, still running. I'm going to go to settings and I'm going to change this to my newly created external switch. I will hit apply and do the same thing on my second virtual machine. Let's go to my default, change that to external. I'm going to hit apply. Now remember, I specifically disabled the adapter. I disabled the NIC on my virtual machine, so I didn't want a bunch of things happening yet until I see it. So now what we've done is I have effectively connected this machine to this newly created external NIC. I've done the same thing for my test VM, and we know that this thing was created, and the checkbox that said, let me play in this world, was checked. They are all going to connect to this external switch that's sitting here, and they're all going to utilize my one single path out to the internet called my physical NIC through my physical LAN out to the world. Still with me? Let's see this in action. I'm going to go back to my test machine. Let's log in here. And I'm going to resize my windows a little bit here because they kind of went all wonky on me. Let's set this guy up as well. There we go. Resize again. I'll just tidy this up a little bit. Good show. Okay, now, moment of truth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to enable each of these adapters. And let's see what happens. Fantastic. Look at this. I'm now connected to something called Network 3. Interesting. And it was Network 4 before. I don't know if you saw that. But look at this. I have a couple things happen here. First off, I have internet connectivity on both of these machines. You can still see I have internet connectivity. Let's minimize this and pop into my command line and take a look and see what's going on. See if we can make sense of this. I'm going to go to my command line option. I'm going to do an IP config. There we go. Now look at this. Look at this address. There was a dynamically assigned address, which is 192.168.1.75. Does that look familiar, that network? It should. Let's take a look at the second machine. I'm going to go to my command line with an IP config. Oh, let's not put an N in there. There we go. This is 192.168.1.79. Now, if you are ahead of me, you're already seeing what I'm trying to throw down here. You're going to see that we have now effectively given an address to these two virtual machines from my local area network. They are actually physically now connected via this external switch to my home network, my local area network. Where did the address come from? Well, my home router is serving as the DHCP server for my environment. These guys did a discover request for their DHCP. This router heard it and assigned two addresses on my local area network. Now, if you remember, my virtual Ethernet adapter didn't have an address. All it was trying to do was say whether this computer is playing in this environment or not. Are we part of the team or do we want to be separate and isolated? And we left that box checked, which means this is part of the network. So what I've effectively done is created one great big happy local area network that includes both of my virtual machines. I've got full internet connectivity to these VMs, and I have the ability to reach every device on my network. I can verify. Let's go to here and I'm going to do a ping to, let's ping the physical NIC of my host. There it is. Let's ping my router, .254. Awesome. There we go. Let's ping the other virtual machine, which is .79. Presto. Everybody's talking. Everybody's connected. I've brought internet connectivity and local area network connectivity to my virtual machines using an external switch. Okay, now remember that little tick box in that virtual Ethernet adapter. That was important. The one that said, I want to share the network environment. Let me go show you. I'm going to go to my virtual switch manager. And remember, on my external switch, this was checked right there. This allow my operating system. Remember I said, don't think of it as sharing. Think of it as participating. I think that's a better, clearer way to understand how this is working. And I've just decided by virtue of this checkbox that it is going to participate in the LAN. Now, what that means is that when I go to my host machine, yeah, look at that. I am connected to the internet. I'm playing as part of the world and I can ping everything from my VMs to my router and everything in between. But what happens if I uncheck that box? Let's see. I'm going to go back to my Hyper-V switch manager. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck this box. Box unchecked. Let's hit apply. I get a warning saying this is going to change configuration of my host adapter. I'm going to click OK. And let's see if we can figure out what happened. Okay, first off, the sky didn't fall. Everything was fine. My virtual machines, let's go check my virtual machines. Can I still ping out to each other? Sure. Okay, can I ping the router? Yes. Do I still have internet connectivity? Let's see if I've got that. 8.8.8. Yes, I can still get out. And I can still ping. Can I still ping this physical adapter? 1.6, there we go, 1.66. Something has changed. That address has been taken out of the equation. And we can see why. I'm going to go to my home computer now, my host computer, and look at this. No network access. So by unchecking that box, what I've effectively done is I've said, I don't want my host machine to participate in this external network environment. In other words, I did this. I said, you can use this to talk, but I don't want to play. There is no longer any connectivity between my host and my virtual and local area networks. Now, to be honest with you, I can't think of very many situations where that's practical. Remember, what I've effectively done is I've completely isolated this host machine in favor of the connectivity for my virtual machines. They're the ones using this particular adapter. They're the ones talking to the router. They're the ones getting out to the world. This host machine, sitting here sad, lonely, completely unconnected, has basically no friends. So while this scenario isn't very practical, let me show you another scenario that is. First, let's go back here and I'm going to bring my host machine back into the environment here. As I said, I'm going to go back to my external switch. Let's apply this checkbox to that option. I'm going to hit apply and I'm going to hit OK. And let's see, nothing has happened on my virtual machines, but if I go back to my world, you can see that now my host machine is now once again part of the local area network. I brought it back to the words before I uncheck that box. So let me show you something that is more practical. And what we're going to do in order to make that work is we're going to build a completely separate external network that is completely isolated from my host network, which will allow both of them to get to the internet. The way we do that, everybody, is by adding another network interface card. Let me show you another diagram to make sense of this. Now, there's no rule that says my host machine has to have one network interface. I could have multiple, as many as my computer can support. And the simplest way to do it is with one of these. This is a USB to Ethernet adapter. Costs about 15 bucks. I can plug this into my computer and connect an Ethernet cable, and I will have two network interfaces. Now, what that lets me do is I can assign a specific network interface to my host machine, such as my primary one, and I can attach my external network to talk to a completely separate second physical network interface. Let me show you. First thing I got to do though is I've got to plug this in. Give me 1 second while I pause the video. And we're back. Through the magic of video editing, I was able to crawl under my desk and connect that USB to Ethernet adapter, and you'll see the difference right now. I'm going to go back to my host machine. There is my new adapter. I now have a completely separate Ethernet adapter path to my local area network. It has its own address. It is dynamically assigned from my local area network. I can verify that with an IP config. There is my second Ethernet adapter right there, 1.80. So my computer now has two NICs, 1.66 and 1.80. Now, because my host computer now has two separate and distinct physical network interfaces, I can allocate one to be used by my host machine, and I can allocate a second one, the different one, to be used by my virtual machines, thereby separating the two of them and allowing me to treat them as independent entities. To do that, I'm going to go back to my Hyper-V Virtual Switch Manager right here, and I'm going to select on the external switch that we built, and I'm going to change the properties. Now, in these properties, I actually have a drop-down menu here that lets me actually decide which physical adapter I want to allocate to my virtual machines, thereby freeing up the other one for my host machine. Now, when I built the external virtual switch, I only had one adapter. It was my Intel gig network connection, and I used that for my virtual machines. But now I have two. I can actually now say to the virtual machines, I don't want you to use my Intel adapter. Let's use my USB to Ethernet adapter right here. and I'm going to send that traffic through a completely different network interface. Now, the cool trick to this is that I now can uncheck this box. I can say, I don't want my host playing in this new virtual world. I want to keep them separate. And I can do that because my host has an alternative path. It has a dedicated network interface card that will allow it to get to the internet without depending on the same NIC that my virtual machines are using. So if I uncheck this box, I'm going to get a warning. It's going to warn me that something's going to change. I'm going to hit yes. Change is being applied. Everything is set. Now, my virtual machines are exiting the world via this USB to Ethernet adapter. I can hit OK. I can go back to these virtual machines really quickly, and I can verify that nothing has changed. Let's ping the router. There we go. I can still get there, as can my second machine. Can I ping the internet? Yes, I can. No problem. So what's going on here is that my machines are borrowing this interface adapter, my USB interface, heading out to the router. Now, my host machine, if I were to go take a look at my settings, I still have internet. So everything is still good there because it's actually using my other adapter. Now, by virtue of us doing that, all we've done is isolate the traffic. We're still part of the same network in this particular configuration. Everybody's still part of the same LAN because we all go to the same router. Both my physical interfaces go to the same home area network. But if we wanted to, there's no rule that says this interface has to go to my home router. As a matter of fact, what I can do is I can point this interface to a completely different router or a completely different interface on my existing router, which will then allow me to assign any address space I wanted, completely independent of my host network. What that lets me do is build two separate and distinct networks isolated from each other, and I can manage them as if they are completely different worlds, which they truly are. My host has the connection to the home router, and it is getting its address and working on this 192.168 network. But if my virtual machines were connected via the interface that were taking me to a completely different place, I could assign completely different addresses to this thing and operate this as a completely different network environment. That's typically how we do it in a networking lab, where we assign a specific NIC to the virtual machines that take me to a completely different router, and my host machine does not lose internet connectivity because it is connected to a different interface that goes to a completely different place. Two isolated networks managed by the host using external switches. Whew, that was a lot. Hopefully you were able to stay with me through all of that. What I tried to do in this video was show you the functional and conceptual differences between all four of your foundational virtual switches in a virtualized environment. I hope that helped with a foundational understanding of some of these virtual switches. Happy networking.